As soon as a shy summer dawn appears on the horizon, everything around sinks into a trembling silence. The air feels charged with a hint of something looming ahead, as if nature itself holds its breath, sensing events capable of turning the lives of millions upside down. In these brief, early moments, while the sun only brushes the tops of the grass and slides with golden reflections across the smooth river, no one yet suspects that one of the most terrifying tragedies in our nation's history is already approaching. This short pause, filled with both quiet hope and vague anxiety, becomes the last calm before one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century bursts into reality. The stillness of this morning clashes sharply with the storm that is about to rip through the fragile fabric of peaceful life. Just beyond the border, a little away from the serene landscape, long rows of soldiers stand ready to attack. Thousands of men, full of self-confidence and illusions of an easy victory. To them, everything seems plain and straightforward, nothing more than a formality, another military march for new medals and titles. Their naive certainty is dangerous, and it will lead directly to a vast tragedy. In these minutes marked by an unnatural quiet, right at a turning point of history, human lives split into before and after. Years later, people will remember this time through the lenses of pain and sorrow, and even decades will not erase the echoes of that morning. Those memories return unexpectedly, as if whispering about how fragile peace is and how irreversible change can be. Some images fade, but the sharpest and most tragic ones cut their way into memory forever. They disturb dreams, slip into moments of solitude, rise even out of the simple sound of dripping water. Thinking back to events so distant in time, memory itself seems wrapped in a thin haze. You would think that with the years, any impression would dim, lose shape. But some things cannot be erased. They push through the flow of time and come back suddenly, flooding the mind in sleep, in quiet moments alone, or even through ordinary sounds of nature like the steady tapping of water in a bucket. In that far-off summer of 1941, I was part of the German army. Along with the others, I crossed the line separating the Reich from the Soviet state. Back then, it felt like routine obedience to a command. We were trained in absolute discipline. There was an order, and you followed it without a second thought. Was there a big difference between this operation and those before it? At first glance, none. But once the illusion peeled away, reality crashed down with brutal force. In the story of the country, June 22, 1941 was destined to be remembered as a day of terrible trials and national mourning. On that morning, under the blows of Nazi forces rushing across a border that stretched from the cold Baltic waters to the warm shores of the Black Sea, began one of the bloodiest periods in the life of the nation. This was the start of the Great Patriotic War, a conflict that exhausted even the very notion of human tragedy and surpassed anything the world had known before. For the Soviet army, that day concentrated all misfortunes at once. In mere hours, the defense of the border units was shattered, even though the soldiers fought with astonishing persistence and self-sacrifice. The Red Army had to retreat deeper into the country. Losses in people, equipment, and supplies grew with every passing hour. Many were captured, and the first hours of the fighting cost tens of thousands of lives and destinies. This day is usually described from the point of view of those who defended their homeland: Soviet soldiers, commanders, border guards, ordinary civilians caught in the path of the invaders. Their deeds and sacrifices are told over and over again. Yet it is rare to hear this story through the eyes of those who attacked. Their perception, their feelings at the center of a rapidly changing reality, are no less important for understanding the full scale of the disaster. That perspective is unique mostly because it rarely becomes public and almost never appears in official documents. German school textbooks do not give detailed accounts of these tragedies, and memoirs of this kind are not common. But to understand the depth of the catastrophe, one must set aside prejudice and look at what happened on the other side of the front. Everything started half a year before that fateful night. The decision to attack the Soviet Union took shape in December 1940, when the famous secret Directive No. 21, the same one called Barbarossa, was issued. That was when Hitler, driven by geopolitical ambition and illusions of a quick victory, approved the plan for the greatest military campaign of the century. Already in January of the next year, trains carrying dozens of divisions from Western Europe began racing east toward the Soviet borders. Officially, this regrouping was explained by entirely different reasons, hiding the true intentions of the Reich. By February and March, the German High Command was working out the next phase. Units moved toward the eastern borders under the cover of night, receiving new tasks without any clear explanation for the growing concentration of forces. At the end of January, a new order from the main headquarters demanded that large formations be moved closer to the USSR, even though the soldiers themselves had no idea what lay ahead. They marched at night through deserted areas, going wherever the command sent them, and only a few guessed the real purpose of the movement. Why keep even their own troops in the dark, let alone the civilians? The secrecy was meant to protect the plan from gossip and leaks. Any piece of news in the German army would have spread in an instant through letters, casual talks in barracks, and stops along the way. Even senior officers learned details of the upcoming attack only shortly before it began, while ordinary soldiers were told almost at the last moment. The huge military machine that included millions of people masked its actions not only from the enemy, but also from the citizens of Germany. Propaganda worked hard to create the illusion of normal preparations for raids against England or support for battles in East Prussia or the Balkans. Construction of defensive lines in the east was explained as an attempt to prevent a possible Soviet attack. Tanks and infantry movements were attributed to exercises or rest after other campaigns. Rumors multiplied at an incredible speed. Some believed that through the USSR German troops would reach the Middle East and then Africa. Others were convinced that the army was preparing to invade Britain and that the concentration of forces was only another stage of preparation. In some units, commanders even mentioned India as a possible destination. Wild theories coexisted with mundane explanations, creating a fog thick enough to avoid panic and keep discipline intact. By early June 1941, the final stage of deployment began. Entire formations moved toward the border under the protection of darkness. Starting on June 10, the units assigned to the operation were taken directly to their concentration zones. A week later, divisions of the 1st Echelon took up attack positions, completing the hidden deployment. In the end, a huge mass of troops had gathered along the Soviet border, about 183 divisions, including 13 brigades of reserves and special units. Nearly 5 million soldiers stood ready, supported by thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and roughly 2,500 aircraft. All this happened against a background of deceptive calm and even a sense of expected peace. Public speeches contained no open hostility toward the Soviet Union. Officials talked about strengthening economic ties and maintaining stability in Eastern Europe. To most Germans, both soldiers and civilians, the USSR remained more of a mysterious neighbor than a real enemy. The news of war struck like a thunderbolt. After years of peaceful declarations, it turned out that the familiar order could crumble in a single night. Propaganda had every tool to distort reality. Promises, invented stories, staged photographs showing German officers as liberators of Europe. The mood in the army and in civilian society was filled not so much with fear as with confusion and inner tension. Open hostility toward the Soviet Union emerged only after the fighting began. Before that, people were told that Germany needed to protect European civilization from the so-called Bolshevik threat, though such rhetoric rarely appeared in everyday conversations. The greatness and tragedy of war reveal themselves not only in reports, strategies, and headquarters documents, but also in the personal stories of ordinary people who found themselves at the sharpest edge of events. The fates of soldiers, commanders, and civilians standing on the front line on June 22 form a living chronicle of this tragedy. German soldiers who had been raised on ideals of discipline and superiority suddenly faced a reality completely unlike their expectations. Diaries, letters home, and brief admissions to comrades reveal a wide range of emotions. At first, there is enthusiasm and confidence, even bravado. Then doubt creeps in, fear grows, despair follows. The turning point comes quickly. Early hopes for a fast return home sink under the weight of the realization that they are trapped in a colossal conflict with no clear way out. Among the defenders of the Brest fortress and many other Soviet garrisons, there is a display of unbroken resilience. Young recruits, military school graduates, ordinary workers, students, seasoned officers. All of them in different circumstances choose not to surrender, but to fight to the end. A Moscow student, a worker from Tula, a sailor from Crimea. Once the attack begins, they form a single field of resistance. Their story is full of drama. Many fought to the last breath in ruins, basements, and burning rooms, turning every brick into a symbol of unyielding defiance. German officers who had survived the fire and fury of earlier European campaigns were stunned to encounter forces that did not crumble under powerful strikes. They admitted this not only in official papers, but also in private letters. They realized they were facing a different kind of courage and suffering. They were shocked by the ability of Soviet soldiers to fight with no hope left, losing everything yet refusing to surrender. This was something entirely alien to those who were used to the logical and predictable structure of Western operations. Inside this avalanche of emotions, fear and endurance, new meanings of the war were forming for each participant. German soldiers were forced to reconsider their relationship to the command, to morality, even to their own sense of choice. Many who survived those first brutal battles no longer dreamed of victory, but only of staying alive. On the Soviet side, a new national myth was being born, strengthened by real episodes of courage and an unbroken spirit. The front line became not just a mark on a map, but a vast field of human tragedies, courage, and despair. Every village, every river crossing, every ruined fortress, every heap of bodies on the roadside became part of a single panorama of the era. Real historical memory was born here, not the monumental kind, but a living one, shaped by experience, pain, fear, and hope. The attackers also felt that the road they had been ordered to follow was turning into a path toward collective moral collapse, something that would haunt them for years. Many understood that they were trapped in an impossible dilemma between obeying orders and rejecting violence as an end in itself. The first wave of fighting not only triggered massive losses, but also created a unique psychological atmosphere. Fear, uncertainty, and a sense that this conflict would drag on without mercy. In a single day, the front lines shifted so dramatically that old stereotypes about the enemy disintegrated. Modern warfare, with aviation, tanks, and heavy artillery, brought a scale unseen before. Yet, even with maximum pressure, the German forces failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. A new type of war became obvious for the attackers. On Soviet territory, there were no fixed paths to victory and no easy routes to forced surrender. Even when the first line of defense was broken, counterattacks followed. Sabotage, ambushes, heavy casualties. German units that had become used to seeing enemies flee in panic now faced resistance where mercy could not be expected. Soviet fighters held out to the last moment, fulfilling orders even when cut off from command and reinforcements. The advantage of surprise turned out to work in both directions. For Soviet units, the shock of the attack served as a spark that ignited fierce defense. For the attackers, it quickly became a burden that led to a long and bloody struggle. By noon of the first day, it was clear that the number of Soviet prisoners was surprisingly small, while German losses were much higher than they had expected after their Western campaigns. As they moved deeper east, German troops encountered not only regular army formations, but also resistance from internal reserves, militias, volunteer groups, and local residents defending their homes. The motivation to fight went far beyond state propaganda. It became a matter of collective identity, something the invaders did not understand and could not predict. For Soviet civilians caught in the battle zone, the first day of the war turned ordinary life into a chain of alarms, evacuations, and news of the dead and wounded. Everyday routines disappeared forever. Everything became mobilization and the concentration of willpower. And in the middle of destruction, a new cultural and national narrative began to form. Paradoxically, both sides faced roughly the same shock. The Germans were stunned by the impossibility of a quick victory. The Soviets were shaken by the sudden attack, but quickly transformed that shock into a fierce resolve. This double surprise marked the real beginning of the war, whose meaning stretched far beyond local battles or diplomatic disputes. The day of June 22, 1941 became a permanent point of no return, where the lives of millions split forever into before and after. It soon became clear that the cost of this conflict would be unimaginable. For the Soviet people, it was the beginning of a time of extraordinary trials, losses, heroism, and the formation of new values and relationships with the past and the future. The main result of the first day was not only the bloody reports and the ruins of garrisons and towns. It was above all the birth of a phenomenon of unbroken resistance that united people regardless of origin, profession, or age. Even those far from the front became participants. Women, children, the elderly. Everyone contributed something. This collective readiness to fight became a key element of the future victory. Stories, letters, diaries, and oral memories played a crucial role. They created an image of the war not as a set of battles, but as an epic of personal lives. Pain gave way to persistence. Fear hardened into determination, and countless private tragedies formed a shared symbol of national unity in the face of disaster. For German soldiers and officers, the first day was a moment of inner collapse. The realization that nothing would be easy came too fast. Belief in Blitzkrieg dissolved, replaced by confusion and heavy thoughts about their own fate. The road they were forced to follow turned into a path toward moral and strategic failure. Every miscalculation became painfully expensive. The turning point became a lesson for the entire era. Some mistakes are fatal and irreversible. Historically, June 22nd became the day when two worlds collided. One was a modern mechanized superstate convinced of its own superiority. The other was a nation clinging to every piece of its homeland and ready to fight to the end. This day shaped the entire future course of the war. It set the foundation for the partisan movement, for feats on the front and in the rear, for the values that later became the basis of the national myth of resistance and victory. The collective memory of the first day eventually took new forms in songs, films, books, and memorials. For every soldier, officer, and ordinary citizen, it held not only pain and loss, but also the understanding that they were part of a vast historical process. In that lies both the tragedy and the triumph of spirit. Through suffering, trials, and courage, a new era was born, a new community, a new hope. Today, decades later, the countless family stories, preserved archives, and living memories still stir the imagination and raise questions about the cost, meaning, and consequences of war. Looking back at this legacy, we see again and again that June 22nd, 1941 became not just an event, but a universal lesson. It speaks of the danger of illusions, the consequences of underestimating the enemy, and the indestructible spirit of those who defend their land and their home. The final conclusion of that first brutal day, when two worlds met on the fields of a bleeding Europe, is simple. There are no easy victories where a nation decides to fight to the very end. The story of the first day is both the story of the aggressor's downfall and the beginning of the victory of a people that no army could break.